Hi, this is Stan Bush.
Hi, this is Stephanie Calvert.
This is John Payne.
This is Jack Hughes.
Hey everyone, this is Britt Lightning from Vixen.
Hi, I'm Carrie Stevens.
Hello, I'm Kofi Baker.
And you're listening to Play That Rock and Roll.
Unfortunately, as the 80s wound down, so did their commercial success. In 1989, they released an album called Lightning Strikes Twice, and that album did not chart at all, which in turn got them dropped from their label. So in 1990, during a concert in Toledo, they announced that the band was breaking up. At that point, lead singer Danny Joe Brown and new guitarist Bobby Ingram, who had replaced founding member Dave Lubeck a couple of years earlier, those two guys wanted to continue, but at this point the band would need a new lineup and also a new label. So the band would go through several lineup changes in the early 90s, and they would exist strictly as a touring act because they didn't have a label. Unfortunately, Danny Joe Brown had a lot of health issues that posed serious challenges to the band at this time. There were several shows he was simply not able to perform at, so they would have to rely on stand-ins to get through those shows. One of those stand-ins was a familiar name from last episode, Jimmy Farrar. Yes, Jimmy Farrar was actually brought back into the Molly Hatchet fold in the early 90s to fill in for Danny Joe from time to time. Unfortunately, fan reception to Jimmy Farrar was even worse in the early 90s than it was in the early 80s. So the band ultimately did not see him as a long-term solution if Danny Joe Brown was going to be sidelined. Another singer that would stand in for Danny Joe was a guy named Phil McCormick, who became good friends with the guys in the band, and after Danny Joe Brown suffered a stroke in 1995, Phil would be the guy that the band would select to move forward with Danny Joe's full blessings. In 1999, Danny Joe Brown said to Swampland.com, "Phil is a good guy. I suggested Phil, and I endorse Phil." Now, I bring this up because it's important to know that the lineup of Molly Hatchet that is often derided by old school fans was a lineup that was largely approved of and encouraged by several of these original members, including Danny Joe Brown. With Phil McCormick as the new lead singer, the band finally got a record deal. They signed with a German label, SPV Recordings, who they are still with today. Now, this new lineup that would feature guitarist Bobby Ingram and vocalist Phil McCormick would also include keyboardist John Galvin. John had originally joined the band in 1983, and he's actually still with the band today. So those three guys would be the core of the group starting in the 90s going forward. They released their first album on this new record deal in June 1996, and that album is called Devil's Canyon. During the recording sessions of this album, Danny Joe Brown attempted to return, but ultimately he would have to retire as his health struggles were just too much to overcome. Phil McCormick would handle all lead vocals. Now, this album is definitely heavier than the albums the band was producing in the 80s, and that is a trend that would continue on to this day. There's a couple of tracks here worth checking out, too. Rolling Thunder is a track that is a tribute to the Vietnam War vets, which is a very patriotic number. But then there's also another track on here called Heartless Land, which is an extremely cynical look at American society. It is a political song, but I would not say there's any partisan message in it. So that's an interesting one to check out. Now, the title track on this album I will absolutely go to bat for, because I believe this is probably the best song of the Phil McCormick era as a whole, and one of the best songs from Molly Hatchet's entire discography. I believe this holds up with the stuff they produced it in their heyday. Take a listen. Here's the title track, Devil's Canyon. So as I said, a louder and heavier album than previous work. Ultimately, I think this is an interesting project and a clear indication of the new direction of the band. Now, as the 90s wound down, Bobby Ingram moved into the position of band leader, as he purchased the rights to the band Molly Hatchet from original member Dwayne Rowland for $250,000 in 2000. Now this right here, this transaction in 2000 is the real dividing line for most old school fans and current fans of Molly Hatchet. The old school fans who loved Dave Lubick and Danny Joe Brown and that group of late 70s Southern rockers, there is a faction of them that really dislike Bobby Ingram and what the band continued on as. I'm not in that group, to be clear, but we are going to talk about why that is in a little bit. But keeping to the chronology here, I want to bring up a quote that I found from that same 1999 interview that Danny Joe Brown did with Swampland.com. He said this of Bobby Ingram, quote, "Bobby was the best guitar player I ever worked with. I felt he was the best, and I still do, to this day." So again, from Danny Joe Brown, a full-throated endorsement of Phil McCormick, and a very strong compliment to Bobby Ingram. Now, in that same interview, this might be where some of the trouble around who owns the band started, because Danny Joe Brown also said this, quote, "As far as the band being called Molly Hatchet, Bobby doesn't have any right to that name at all. The only right Bobby has to the name Molly Hatchet is the right I gave him. That's all he's got. I think you should call it the Bobby Ingram Band. Damn sure ain't Molly Hatchet, and you can underline damn." So there seems to have been a falling out at some point. I can't quite pinpoint where or exactly why, but Danny Joe Brown also said this, quote, "Bobby Ingram didn't start Molly Hatchet, so he can't be Molly Hatchet. He was brought in by me, and that's all Bobby ever will be. I hate that, but that's the truth. You know, since I've left the group, Bobby has never sent me a get well card or anything, not a phone call or anything, to say he hoped I would get better. Nothing. He just sent me a paper that said he was taking the name and stuff." So I think this quote right here is what old school fans point to for why they resent Bobby. Now, Bobby actually did respond to these remarks on Swampland.com by saying that he absolutely kept in touch with Danny and that it was Danny that stopped communicating with him. Now, I can't litigate this stuff. This is all, 25 years ago. So it's a lot of he said, and my best read of it is that there are two sides to every story, and in this case, I imagine there is some degree of truth to both sides. Obviously, there was a falling out, and there was some sort of disagreement over the name, but Bobby acquired the name Molly Hatchet legally, and Danny Joe gave him a hell of a compliment on his guitar playing. And I think that's worth bringing up, because that's why he was brought into the band in the first place, because he is a seriously underrated guitar player.